I fell asleep that day and had this incredibly bizarre dream. It felt like reading some fictional novel, but for some reason, I just couldn't bring myself to look away until the very last page. For years, my son Julian had been making fun of my woodworking, but the night it all finally shattered was when he stood there in front of his wealthy investors, swirling a glass of red wine, and literally tapped on the oak dining table my late husband loved more than anything, making a joke about how his own father died. "And that, gentlemen, is exactly why my dad ended up having a heart attack," he chuckled. He and those suited Seattle elites let out this big roaring laugh right there in the dining room I built with my own hands. The entire room instantly went dead silent. My oldest son just stared down at the smoked brisket on his plate. My youngest daughter looked like she was about to burst into tears. As for me, I just stood there frozen by the door of my old workshop, clutching a wood rasp so tightly my knuckles turned white and started to ache. That night, after over 30 years of hosting our traditional first Sunday of the month family dinners, I quietly made a decision. Julian was never going to be invited through that door again. He thought he was just turning his nose up at some old furniture. He had absolutely no idea he was tearing down the very last bond holding this family together. If you've ever been deeply hurt by someone you love most in the world, I would really love to hear your story. If these kinds of family struggles resonate with you, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is over there right now. I always read through your comments very carefully. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 64 years old, a widow, and I live completely alone in a century-old Victorian house on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. This is the house where I raised my 3 kids. Most of my life these days is incredibly quiet. I still wake up before sunrise because my body just remembers the internal clock I've had for decades. I brew my coffee using an old machine I bought at a Sears department store over 20 years ago, a place that doesn't even exist anymore. I'll go out to water the Boston ferns on the porch, and I'll put out some food for the stray orange tabby cat that strolls into the backyard at exactly 7 every morning. After that, I walk into my woodworking shop and just sit there in the quiet. People always think that when you get older, this kind of silence is peaceful. Sometimes it is, but other times it just feels like grief echoing through empty rooms. My husband, Arthur Vance, has been gone for 6 years now. Even saying those words out loud today still doesn't feel real. 6 years. Sometimes, when 5:30 in the afternoon rolls around, I still reflexively turn my head toward the front door, expecting to hear the jingling of his keys. Arthur was the kind of man who could warm up the entire house just by stepping inside. He was a high school history teacher, tall, soft-spoken, with a big booming laugh. He taught at the same public high school for 30 years and never once complained about the small paycheck. Every single Friday night, he would come home smelling like chalk dust, and the crisp, late autumn air kiss my forehead and ask the exact same question. "What's new in the shop today, El?" It didn't matter if I was carving a little wooden horse or sanding down a bulky rocking chair, he would always praise my work like he was looking at a masterpiece by a world-class artist. In this house, handmade things were sacred to Arthur. At 4 in the afternoon on the first Sunday of every single month, our massive handmade oak dining table would be piled high with barbecue, beer, kids' laughter, and endless stories. We started that tradition when the kids were little because money was incredibly tight back then. We couldn't afford vacations to national parks or dinners at fancy restaurants, so Arthur always said we would use our own 2 hands to make our home the most luxurious place on earth. "As long as we're sitting around this table we built ourselves, we are whole," he used to tell me. Back then, I believed that with all my heart. Maybe I still do. I have 3 children. My oldest, Marcus, is 40. He lives about a 20-minute drive away and runs a local hardware and building supply store. Marcus has always been down to earth and kind, just like his dad, and he's never been ashamed of his blue-collar roots. Then there's my youngest daughter, Sarah. Sarah is a park ranger at Mount Hood National Forest. She's incredibly soft-hearted and emotional, the kind of woman who cries at sentimental Super Bowl commercials and pulls over on the highway to help an injured deer. She calls me almost every single evening, just to make sure I didn't forget to eat dinner out in the workshop again. And then there's Julian, my middle child. These days, he's a partner at a top architectural firm in Seattle. When he was a kid, Julian was incredibly smart and intensely ambitious. He always craved so much more than this rainy suburban town could ever offer. More money, classier tastes, a more sophisticated lifestyle. Even as a teenager, he absolutely loathed thrift stores, his older brother's hand-me-downs, and the heavy, handmade solid wood furniture around the house. When he turned 18, he told me he was going to leave this life covered in sawdust behind forever. By 22, he did exactly that. Now, he and his wife, Chloe, live in a multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse in downtown Seattle, complete with minimalist marble countertops imported straight from Italy and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound. Chloe is a high-end interior designer, and their life on social media looks like it was ripped straight out of the pages of an architectural magazine. The strange thing is, Julian wasn't always ashamed of us. When he was really little, he used to spend hours standing in my workshop, wearing one of Arthur's old shirts that dragged on the floor as an apron. He would use his tiny hands to hand me sheets of sandpaper, and when he thought I wasn't looking, he'd sneak wood shavings into his pockets. "Mom," he told me when he was 8 years old, "the wooden birds you make look like they're going to fly away any second." I remember that so clearly because Arthur just burst out laughing and said, "See? Even the kid knows you've got magic in those hands." Sometimes I catch myself wondering where that little boy covered in sawdust went. Maybe life just taught him that simple, honest love is completely worthless when faced with wealth and social status. After Arthur passed away, those monthly family gatherings became even more vital to me. Grief changes a family. In the beginning, it pulls everyone tightly together. But then, slowly and silently, it starts to push people apart. I was so terrified that without Arthur there to hold us together, everyone would just drift away into their own separate lives until holidays became nothing more than awkward obligations instead of genuine reunions. So I kept right on woodworking, and I kept right on hosting that family barbecue every first Sunday of the month. I smoked briskets, made pulled pork, baked mashed potatoes, and even carved new wooden toys for my grandkids. I did it because it was the only way I knew how to keep everyone close to me. For a while, it actually worked. Marcus would still show up early to help me chop firewood and start the grill. Sarah would bring over her home-brewed apple cider. The grandkids would run around screaming on the porch, and country music would play softly from my old radio. But Julian, ever since he moved to Seattle and married Chloe, he changed. It started out with small things. He began criticizing the dust in the house, the smoke from the barbecue, the old Victorian window frames, and how the solid wood chairs I built were too bulky and lacked proper ergonomics. Finally, he started criticizing me. "Mom, you're still living like it's a countryside in the last century. You do know people don't use this kind of heavy raw log furniture anymore, right? It makes the whole space feel incredibly suffocating." In the beginning, he'd say these things with a laugh, so everyone else would laugh along, including me. That's the thing about humiliation. When it starts out slow, you convince yourself it isn't real. You tell yourself they don't mean any harm. You make excuses because the truth just hurts too much. But as time went on, his comments got sharper and nastier. Every single dinner, whenever he was there, I started feeling anxious inside my own home. I'd constantly check the corners for any stray sawdust, wondering what Julian was going to criticize next, and I even started hiding my favorite oak carvings away in the storage room because I suddenly felt ashamed of them. I remember one Friday afternoon I stood inside a high-end home decor store, just staring at a cold, modern chair made of stainless steel and plastic for nearly 10 minutes, because Julian's voice was already ringing in my head. "Mom, do you have any idea how outdated your taste is?" I didn't end up buying the chair, and then I just sat there and cried in my pickup truck. It sounds completely ridiculous now, crying over a chair. But it was never actually about the chair. It was about that slow, agonizing realization that your own child no longer values the very things that used to fill your family with love. And the worst part was, I still kept saving that most comfortable wooden chair for him every single month. Because no matter how much Julian changed, a part of me still believed that the little boy in the oversized shirt covered in sawdust would come back one day. I just didn't realize how much damage hope could do before it completely shatters. The very first time Julian openly mocked my craftsmanship was during a 4th of July barbecue. There weren't any special guests that day, just our family. Marcus was already working on his second helping of brisket, and Sarah was helping her little nephew fix a toy. The backyard was filled with the smoky smell of the grill and the scent of early summer grass. For a brief moment it felt just like the old days. Then, Julian set his beer bottle down and let out this dramatic sigh. "My God, Mom," he chuckled. "Are you really planning on keeping this old dining table here forever? The varnish is completely peeling off. The whole yard went quiet for a second. I just gave a nervous little laugh. Yeah, your dad and I built this together the year we got married. Julian and Chloe exchanged a look. Well, that certainly explains a lot, Chloe snickered under her breath. Sarah immediately jumped in. But it's incredibly sturdy and it holds so many memories. I'm not saying it isn't sturdy, Julian shot back. I'm saying this is exactly why the blue-collar class can never grow their asset value. This kind of crude, poorly made stuff drags the appraisal value of the entire house down by at least 20%. He laughed again, as if wrapping his words in business jargon somehow made them completely harmless. I remember just looking down, staring at my plate, and completely losing my appetite. Marcus tried to change the subject, asking, So, Mom, are you still planning on remodeling the attic this year? But Julian wasn't done. I'm serious, he kept going. You know people are all about minimalism these days, right? There's a reason people pay for professional interior designers. I let out a soft laugh because everyone else looked so uncomfortable. Well, you kids managed to grow up just fine in this crude house. Julian shrugged. Barely survived it. Everyone forced a smile after that, but the whole mood in the backyard had completely shifted. And somehow, this became the pattern. Every single month, at every single dinner, there would be a new comment, a new joke, a new reminder that the home I spent decades building for the people I loved had become an embarrassment to my own son. Sometimes it was subtle. Mom, the carving on these cabinets is so busy. Have you ever thought about replacing them with handleless lacquered panels? Other times, it was much worse. One evening I brought out a little wooden train I had just finished making for my grandson. Julian stared at that toy like I had just placed a pile of toxic waste on the table. You know, he said, taking a sip of his craft beer, kids these days need smart, educational toys, not primitive things that could end up giving them splinters. Marcus rolled his eyes immediately. Can we just have a nice dinner for once without turning the backyard into your architectural TED Talk? Julian just ignored him. I'm just trying to help Mom evolve a little. Evolve? That word echoed in my mind all night long. It felt like I was an obsolete product that needed upgrades, like an old appliance, or a piece of worn-out furniture, or just an old woman. The hardest part wasn't even the criticism itself. It was the way Chloe fed into it. Years ago, when Julian first brought Chloe home, she seemed so charming. She had the designer trench coat, the flawless smile, the pleasant accent, the kind of woman who always looks you straight in the eye when she talks to you, which makes her seem so genuine. But as time went on, I noticed something. Chloe loved making people feel small, especially anyone she thought came from a lesser background than her. She never insulted me directly. People like her rarely do. Instead, she used politeness as a weapon. Oh, Eleanor, this country style is just so nostalgic. Wow, I haven't seen woodwork this raw since I did community service in the Appalachian Mountains back in college. It really gives off that pure working-class comfort. Every single word sounded like a compliment until you heard the underlying tone, and Julian started turning into an exact copy of her. Before that 4th of July gathering that completely changed everything, I spent nearly 3 weeks deep cleaning the house, sanding down the backyard deck, and putting a fresh coat of natural beeswax on every single piece of wooden furniture. I even used some of the old cedar wood Arthur left behind to carve a brand new set of patio chairs. I wanted everything to be absolutely perfect because Julian said he was bringing along a few real estate investors from Seattle who were in Portland looking at property, and they wanted to stop by for a barbecue. To this day, I still don't understand why I cared so much. Maybe a mother never stops trying to win her children's approval. His investors arrived looking like commercial models who had just walked off a golf course. They wore spotless casual clothes, expensive Swiss watches, and carried an effortless confidence. They politely complimented the house. One of the men looked around my dining room and asked, "Wow, how long have you lived here?" 40 years, I replied proudly. Julian let out a soft chuckle. She refuses to update a single thing. Every inch of this place rejects modern civilization. Everyone laughed politely. And just like that, that familiar sense of shame started creeping into my chest all over again. Dinner started out normal enough. Everyone ate brisket, drank beer, and talked. Then, one of Julian's investors touched the big oak dining table we were sitting around and said in admiration, "This table is unbelievable. The wood grain is gorgeous. What antique shop did you find this in?" Before I could even open my mouth to say thank you, Julian jumped right in. Oh, believe me, it's an antique all right. It's a little project my parents threw together themselves when they were young because they were too broke to afford IKEA. The people at the table laughed. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't intentionally cruel, but it was enough. It was enough to make my face instantly burn with embarrassment. It was enough to make me suddenly feel completely ridiculous, standing there in my apron, trying to impress people who were never going to respect me. Sarah frowned right away. "Julian, what are you talking about?" she asked innocently. "I'm just kidding." Marcus slammed his beer can down on the table with a dull thud. "You make a joke out of Mom at every single dinner." Julian blinked. "Oh, come on, everyone is being so dramatic." Chloe just pursed her lips a little off to the side, staying quiet. I quickly stood up. "Does anyone want more iced tea?" That was always my move. Change the subject, smooth things over. Pretend nothing hurt because I was terrified that a confrontation would completely ruin the dinner. But the truth was, the dinner had been ruined a long time ago. I just wasn't ready to admit it. Later that night, after the investors left, Sarah stayed behind to help me clean up the kitchen. While she washed the dishes, I packed the leftover brisket into plastic containers. Finally, she looked at me carefully and asked, "Mom, why do you let him treat you like that?" I kept my eyes glued to the sink. "He doesn't mean any harm." Sarah let out a soft sigh. "No, Mom, he does." I froze for a second. Those words cut deep because I knew Sarah was right. But I still found myself defending Julian. He's under so much pressure. Seattle is incredibly competitive, and that high-end real estate crowd is just different. His whole world has changed. Sarah shook her head. "No, Mom, becoming successful doesn't turn a kind person into a cruel one." I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I kept making excuses because the alternative was just too much to bear. If Julian really meant what he was saying, if he truly looked down on me from the bottom of his heart, then maybe I had lost my son years ago and just hadn't realized it. After Sarah left, I sat alone in my workshop for nearly an hour. The house was dead quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stared at the unfinished wood carving on my workbench, and I suddenly remembered something Arthur told me right after Julian first moved to Seattle. "He's trying too hard to be a big deal." I laughed at the time and asked him what he meant. Arthur just shrugged. "People who are truly comfortable with who they are don't need to spend all their time proving they're better than where they came from." I wished so hard that he was still alive. Not because he could magically fix everything, but because Julian would never act like this in front of him. Arthur had this calm authority that kept everyone grounded. Even Julian would soften up around his father. After Arthur died, everything changed. It was like Julian decided that the humble blue-collar parts of his life could finally be erased, and unfortunately, I was one of those parts. Even so, on the first Sunday of every month, I kept preparing. I kept hoping, and I kept believing that the next dinner would be different. Maybe Julian would actually praise something. Maybe he'd remember who he used to be. Maybe he'd stop treating my love like an embarrassment. But hope becomes incredibly dangerous when it keeps forcing you to accept pain you should have walked away from a long time ago. And I was getting closer and closer to my limit. I just didn't know it yet. On that 4th of July night when everything completely shattered, the breaking point was still that very same table. It was 9 in the evening, and fireworks were already starting to go off in the distant night sky. We were sitting around the oak table in the backyard, drinking the last of the coffee. Everyone was doing their best to maintain a fragile surface peace, until Chloe looked at an old scratch on the table and wrinkled her nose. "Eleanor, you really should find someone to just chop this thing up for firewood. It's probably full of bacteria," Marcus said coldly. "Dad made that by hand. That scratch happened when I was 10 years old and accidentally hit it with a screwdriver. Instead of yelling at me, Dad taught me how to sand it down." Julian rolled his eyes. "Yeah, because Dad just loved that kind of worthless grunt work." I felt a sharp knot tie up in my stomach. I forced a smile. "That was your father's way of showing love. He always said that things made by hand are the only things with a soul." Julian let out a laugh. It wasn't a gentle laugh, but a short, sharp, cynical smirk. "Oh, believe me, that wasn't a soul. That was just stubborn poverty." Marcus frowned instantly. But Julian didn't stop. He had drank too much wine, and the polished disguise he usually wore was completely off. "No, I'm serious. Mom always romanticizes this crude manual labor, like it's some badge of honor that our family didn't have the money to buy decent things. Chloe snickered into her wine glass. Sarah kept her eyes locked on her plate. My breathing started getting heavy and fast. Julian leaned back in his chair, looked around the old house, and said the words that changed everything. And that is exactly why Dad ended up having a heart attack. If he had just spent the money to hire professionals to fix this broken house, instead of insisting on proving himself with this low-class manual labor, he'd probably still be alive right now. Dead silence. Absolute, total silence. It felt like even the sound of the distant fireworks had completely vanished. I think my brain stopped working for a second. Because Arthur didn't die from overworking himself with manual labor. He died from a congenital blood vessel condition, something the doctor said was a ticking time bomb that could have gone off at any moment. Julian knew that. Everyone at the table knew that. Sarah looked up, completely horrified. "Julian!" she roared under her breath. Marcus slammed his hands down and stood up so fast his chair went flying backward, crashing onto the ground. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Julian blinked, looking like he genuinely didn't understand why everyone was reacting this way. "My God, I'm not making a medical diagnosis. Are you guys seriously bringing Dad into this over a few pieces of junk wood?" "You're the one who brought Dad into this," Marcus yelled. Julian crossed his arms immediately. "Why is everyone so sensitive?" I was standing by the table holding a pot of hot coffee. Suddenly, I noticed my hands were shaking. It wasn't a little tremor. They were violently shaking. I managed to set the coffee pot down hard on the table before I dropped it on the floor. Chloe looked incredibly uncomfortable now too, keeping her eyes glued to her phone. Finally, Chloe spoke up. "I think everyone is totally overreacting." Sarah snapped out of her chair, her voice shaking from a mix of pure rage and deep heartbreak. "No, it's the two of you. Every single time you come here, you humiliate Mom, and now you're not even leaving Dad alone." Julian let out a look of pure disbelief and scoffed. "Humiliate her? Are you serious right now? I'm just stating facts." I couldn't even speak. That was the strangest part. It felt like all the hurt from the past few years had finally piled up way too high in my chest. All of a sudden, I couldn't force a smile anymore. I couldn't smooth things over. And I couldn't pretend like nothing happened. Because this time, he wasn't just insulting my craftsmanship. He was insulting the memory of the man I loved more than anyone, and he was insulting the entire life we built together. Marcus looked like he was about to explode with anger. Sarah was on the verge of tears, and Julian just stood there looking annoyed instead of ashamed. Right at that exact second, something inside of me quietly and permanently changed. I didn't yell and I didn't argue. I just slowly untied my canvas apron and laid it down on the wooden table. Then I looked my son straight in the eye. For the first time in years, I stopped making excuses for him. After everyone left, I stood completely alone in the empty backyard. There were beer bottles and leftover fireworks wrappers scattered all over the ground. Usually after one of these dinners, even if I was exhausted, I'd have this full, warm feeling in my heart, but that night I just felt completely hollow. Sarah hadn't left yet. I didn't even realize she had stayed behind. "Oh, Mom," she said, her voice immediately cracking. I quickly wiped my face. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." She walked over and wrapped her arms tightly around me, holding me the exact same way I used to hold her when she had a nightmare as a little girl. Suddenly, a terrible realization hit me. My kids had spent years watching me slowly shrink inside my own home. Sarah let go of me, her face completely flushed with anger now. I cannot believe he actually said that about Dad. I just stared at the oak table. He didn't mean it that way. Sarah's expression completely changed. The anger vanished, replaced by pure disbelief. "Mom," she whispered, "why do you always protect him?" I didn't answer because I truly didn't know anymore. Maybe mothers are just wired to protect their children, even when those children are the ones tearing them apart. A few minutes later, Marcus pulled his truck into the driveway and walked out to the yard. The muscles in his jaw were still locked tight. "If he ever talks to you like that again, I am completely done with him," he said, his voice flat and dead serious. "Marcus." "No," he cut me off. "I mean it." He ran his hand through his hair, visibly frustrated. He acts like he's completely ashamed of this family. Sarah nodded in silence. Marcus looked at me. "And Chloe is even worse." I let out a heavy sigh. "She's just going along with what he says." "No," Marcus fired back instantly. "She's feeding into it." Deep down, I knew he was right. Chloe had never once stopped Julian or tried to soften his comments. If anything, she seemed to find them amusing. It was like watching Julian criticize his own family somehow proved to her that they were a step above us. Marcus leaned against one of the porch pillars. You know what Dad would do if he were here tonight? That question hit me like a physical blow because, yes, I knew exactly what Arthur would do. Arthur never tolerated cruelty, especially not toward family. He believed disagreements were just a part of life, but humiliation was a completely different story. Humiliation destroys trust, and once trust breaks inside a family, everything else eventually crumbles right along with it. I looked around at everything. The old-fashioned window frames Julian hated, the faded wallpaper, and the scratches on the oak table left behind by decades of family dinners. Every single mark in this house held a memory, but Julian only saw things that were outdated, cheap, and embarrassing. Sarah quietly helped me finish cleaning up the yard while Marcus took the trash out to the curb. For a while, nobody even mentioned Julian's name. Then, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Julian. I stared at the screen for a long time before I finally opened it. Mom, you guys seriously overreacted tonight. I felt a sudden chill spread through my chest. No apology, no acknowledgement of what he said, just annoyance. A few seconds later, another text popped up. Honestly, I was just trying to help you out. You're still living like a 1980s carpenter. The world today is all about efficiency and maximizing your assets. And then one more text. And if I'm being completely honest, the whole warm blue-collar family routine is just really embarrassing when you're around successful people. I read that sentence 3 times. Embarrassing when you're around successful people. Sarah saw the look on my face immediately. What did he say? Without a word, I handed her the phone. The moment Sarah finished reading it, her expression turned completely to stone. Oh my God. Marcus walked back inside right then. What now? Sarah handed him the phone. He stared at it for a long time, then let out a bitter chuckle. Well, there it is. What? I asked, wrinkling my forehead. He's ashamed of us, he said quietly. The truth hurt because it sounded so absolute now. I slowly sat down on a stool by the kitchen counter. This was the exact spot where I used to build little wooden trains for Julian when he was small, the exact spot where Arthur used to help him with his geometry homework. Every major milestone of his life had happened right here in this house filled with sawdust and life. And somehow, he looked at it now and saw nothing but shame instead of love. Marcus sat down right next to me. You shouldn't have to deal with this, Mom. I stared at the chair Arthur always used to sit in. In the years since Arthur died, I kept waiting for the grief to get smaller. But grief doesn't shrink. Life just keeps growing around it. Standing there, a painful reality washed over me. Julian's cruelty hurt so deeply because it felt like I was losing another piece of Arthur, too. Those family dinners weren't just about eating. They were memories, traditions, the last living threads of the life we built together. And every single joke Julian made was cutting away at those threads. I thought about the days leading up to his visits, how anxious I would get, hiding away pieces of furniture I loved just to accommodate him, desperately trying to keep my own son from feeling embarrassed by me. How many years had I spent begging for the kind of love that was supposed to be unconditional? Sarah sat across from me, completely quiet. Then she asked softly, Mom, are you still going to invite him next month? The room went completely dead silent. Because for the first time in my life, the answer didn't just fly out of my mouth. Normally I would instantly say, of course he's my son. But this time, I pictured the image of Julian laughing and insulting Arthur's memory. I pictured the confused, uncomfortable looks on my grandkids' faces every single month. I pictured myself crying alone in my workshop after spending days pouring my heart into building things, only to have them casually mocked. And then, a profound sense of exhaustion washed over me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't dramatic, it was just a deep, heavy tiredness. I looked down at the family calendar hanging right next to the refrigerator. Every first Sunday dinner was carefully marked in blue ink. I reached out and grabbed a pen. Sarah watched me in silence. Marcus stopped moving. Without saying a single word, I drew a line right through Julian's name on next month's guest list. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper felt incredibly loud in the quiet room. Final. I stared at that line over my son's name for a few seconds. My chest ached, but beneath the pain, there was also a sense of relief. It was small and unfamiliar, but it was absolutely real. For the first time in years, I realized something. Protecting your family should never come at the cost of destroying yourself. The first Sunday dinner without Julian felt completely off from the second I woke up. It wasn't a feeling of peace, and it wasn't a feeling of victory. It was just strange. For nearly 40 years, Sunday mornings in my house had followed the exact same rhythm. I'd drink my coffee, tidy up the yard, and head out to the workshop to finish up whatever wooden gifts I was making for the kids. Tucked into every single detail was this subconscious preparation for Julian's critical eyes at 4 o'clock. That morning, I caught myself instinctively trying to cover up things that looked unpolished. I reached out to move an old chair that had a little crack in it, but then I hesitated. I stopped. There was nobody coming who was going to judge me. Realizing that brought this incredibly strange wave of relief. I stood alone in the living room, staring at that chair, and slowly started laughing out loud. It was a quiet laugh, the kind you only let out when you suddenly realize just how exhausted you've been carrying a heavy weight. So, I set up the backyard exactly the way it used to be when Arthur was alive. No hiding anything, no apologies, no trying to impress a soul. I brought out all the rough but sturdy handmade furniture. I made a huge batch of baked beans in Arthur's favorite cast iron pot. For the first time in years, getting ready for the dinner didn't feel like a high-stress job. It felt comfortable again. Around 2 in the afternoon, Sarah showed up carrying a bundle of wildflowers. She walked out to the backyard and stopped dead in her tracks. "Oh my God," she said, taking a dramatic, deep breath. "It smells exactly like our childhood out here." I let out a soft laugh. "Is it really that dramatic?" She walked right over to it, running her hand along the carved wooden bench I usually hid away. "You brought all the old stuff out." "Yeah, I did." Sarah gave me this soft, knowing smile, and in that exact moment, a painful realization washed over me. My other kids had noticed every single compromise I had been making for Julian over the years. Marcus showed up with the kids about an hour later. The grandkids started cheering the second they caught a whiff of the barbecue smoke in the backyard. "Grandma made smoked brisket, I knew it," Marcus laughed, tossing his jacket over a chair. "See, this is why your house is the ultimate holiday spot." I couldn't help but smile. The gathering that night felt incredibly light. That's really the only way I can describe it. Nobody criticized how the yard looked. Nobody mocked how old the house was. Nobody disguised mean, passive-aggressive comments as jokes. The grandkids were laughing loudly, and there wasn't a single ounce of tension around the table. Sarah told a hilarious story about encountering a black bear at the national park, and Marcus got into an argument with the boys about how the Seahawks were playing. A few times throughout dinner, I caught myself waiting for that familiar wave of anxiety. But it never came. There were no sharp words cutting through the warmth, no awkward silences, and no humiliation. Just family. At one point, Sarah quietly looked around the table and said, "Things feel different tonight." Marcus nodded right away. "Yeah, they do." Nobody actually mentioned Julian's name, but everyone knew exactly what they were talking about. After dessert, Sarah asked if she could take a family photo to post on Instagram. The boys made funny faces, and Marcus pretended to hate having his picture taken. I stood right in the middle, holding a wooden soup spoon I had just finished carving. One of the pictures caught me laughing completely from the heart. It wasn't forced, it wasn't polite, it was completely real. I hadn't even realized how long it had been since someone captured a photo of me looking that genuinely happy. By 8:30, everyone had headed home, and the house fell back into its quiet rhythm. I slowly cleaned up the kitchen, humming a little tune to myself. For the first time in years, a Sunday dinner without Julian didn't end with me crying. I wasn't replaying cruel comments over and over in my head. I wasn't questioning if I had done something wrong as a mother. I just felt a deep sense of peace. That peace lasted for exactly 43 minutes. At 9:17, my phone started ringing. Julian. I stared down at the screen. A part of me wanted to just ignore it, but I picked it up anyway. "Hello?" His voice came through the speaker instantly, sharp and freezing cold. "You had the family dinner tonight?" I blinked. Yes, I did. "And you didn't invite me?" There it was. No asking how I was doing, no self-reflection, just pure offended anger. I leaned against the kitchen counter. "We have dinner on the first Sunday of every month, Julian. It's not a secret." "That's not what I asked, Mom." I closed my eyes for a second. In the background, I could hear the city noise bleeding through his phone. Car horns, a distant siren somewhere in Seattle. "I saw Sarah's post," Julian continued. "You guys threw a family dinner behind my back." He said it like it was some kind of massive betrayal. I looked around my quiet house, the exact home he had spent years insulting. I felt an incredibly strange calmness wash over me. Yes, I answered softly. A long, heavy silence followed. Then he let out this scoff of pure disbelief. Wow, he said. What is this? So we're really going to play games now? What do you mean? You're punishing me because of what happened on the 4th of July? Punishing you? That's an interesting word to use. It's funny how when I finally take a step back to protect myself from being hurt, I'm suddenly the one being cruel. I took a deep breath. Julian, nobody is punishing you. You are. You deliberately left me out. My chest tightened up a little bit, but my voice stayed completely steady. You've looked miserable at these dinners for years now. That is ridiculous. Another heavy silence stretched between us. I don't think Julian expected me to fight back. Definitely not with this kind of calm resolve. Usually during an argument, I'd be the first to apologize just to keep the peace. But after that 4th of July night, something had shifted permanently. Maybe pain eventually burns away all the fear inside of you. Julian let out a bitter laugh. So Marcus and Sarah have you ganging up on me now? No, they don't. Then what is this? I looked down at the dish towel I was holding in my hands. Then, calmly and honestly, I finally said the words I had been holding back for years. I just figured you'd be a lot happier if you didn't have to force yourself to be inside a broken house you clearly despise. Dead silence. Absolute, total silence. I could practically hear him trying to process what I had just said. Then, his voice hardened up instantly. My God, do you really have to take every single joke so seriously? Julian, you were not joking. No, I replied gently. You were humiliating me. Hearing those words out loud actually shocked me a little bit, because it was the very first time I had unreservedly acknowledged the truth. Julian went on the defensive immediately. You are being so dramatic. I don't think I am. You are literally cutting your own son out of family dinners over a few pieces of old wood furniture. The irony of that almost made me laugh out loud. Wood furniture? As if that was the actual problem here. This has never been about the wood or the house, Julian. Then what is it about? I finally gave him the honest truth. It's about respect. Another long pause followed. Then, for the first time in years, I actually heard a hint of uncertainty in Julian's voice. Are you seriously this upset over one comment? One comment? I stared across the room at Arthur's empty chair. No, I whispered. I'm exhausted from years of countless comments. Julian let out a massive sigh. You know what? Fine. If everyone wants to be this sensitive, go right ahead. Sensitive. There was that word again. As if basic human kindness was somehow a synonym for weakness. Then he added coldly, honestly, Chloe told me this exact kind of thing was going to happen sooner or later. That caught my attention immediately. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing. No, Julian, what does that mean? He hesitated for a second, then let out a dramatic sigh. She said you always use this whole blue-collar family bond thing to guilt-trip everyone. That comment hit me a lot harder than I expected it to, because suddenly, everything made perfect sense. Chloe never saw these dinners as love. She saw them as an obligation, a manipulation, something old-fashioned and emotionally inconvenient. And slowly but surely, Julian had started believing it too. A profound sense of exhaustion took over me. I see. Julian's voice softened up just a fraction for the first time. So that's it? You're just shutting me out now? That question broke my heart just a little bit, because despite everything that had happened, for a split second, he sounded exactly like my little boy again. But then I remembered the 4th of July. I remembered Arthur's memory. I remembered the years of humiliation and the anxiety before every single visit. Finally, I told him the absolute truth. No, Julian, I'm just done begging my own son to be kind to me. He didn't say anything back, and neither did I. The silence stretching between us felt absolutely massive. Then, without another single word, Julian hung up the phone. Standing completely alone in my kitchen, a terrifying realization hit me. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel guilty. After that phone call, Julian didn't contact me for 4 whole days. That was incredibly unusual for him. Normally, after a fight, he would either double down right away or pretend like absolutely nothing happened. Silence just wasn't his style. So, by Thursday afternoon, I knew a storm was brewing. I was out in the workshop sanding down a wooden jewelry box when my phone buzzed again. Julian. This time I answered very carefully. Hello. His voice was incredibly calm. Too calm. I've been doing some thinking. Just hearing that sentence made my stomach tighten up. Julian only sounded that controlled when he was furious and hiding it behind a cold mask. I think we need to talk about what happened. I slowly set my sandpaper down on the workbench. Okay. I think you're letting Marcus and Sarah manipulate you. I closed my eyes for a brief second. There it was. No taking responsibility, no self-reflection, just pointing fingers. They are not manipulating me, Julian. They've always been incredibly jealous of me, Julian kept going, especially Marcus. I almost laughed out loud at how completely backward that was. Marcus had spent his entire childhood looking out for Julian, fighting his battles, teaching him how to drive, and constantly protecting him in high school. But success has a strange way of completely rewriting a person's memory. Nobody is jealous of you, I said quietly. Then why am I suddenly being treated like the villain here? I looked out the window at the backyard, staring at the massive oak tree where Arthur used to help them build tree houses. Do you honestly not understand? Julian let out a dramatic sigh. Mom, people bust each other's chops. It's normal. No, I countered softly. Cruelty only becomes normal when people stop fighting back against it. Silence. Then his tone got much sharper. So now I'm cruel. The old version of me would have backed down instantly, softening the truth just to avoid a confrontation. But something inside of me had changed permanently. I didn't want a peace that was built on pretending I wasn't hurt anymore. I think you've been hurting me for a very long time, I answered honestly. The other end of the line went completely dead quiet. For a second, I pictured Julian standing in his expensive Seattle apartment, holding his phone with that familiar look of pure disbelief he always got whenever someone challenged him. Finally, he spoke up again. Are you actually serious right now? What do you mean? You're acting like I abused you or something, all because I made a few comments about some junk wood. Junk wood. As if the pieces I poured my heart into were just worthless scraps. I leaned against my workbench. Julian, it has never been about the wood. Then explain it to me. So I did. For the first time in his life, I stopped protecting him from the weight of his own actions. Lun, you make fun of everything in this house, I said. Silence. You mock the way we live. No response. You laugh at things I build with my own hands. A heavy sigh. You look down on where you came from. His breathing sounded frustrated now. And on the 4th of July, I continued carefully, you insulted your father's memory. Julian exploded instantly. My God, I did not insult Dad. I just said he shouldn't have been doing that low-class manual labor. You made a joke about his death. I was kidding. You humiliated me in front of strangers. That is ridiculous. No, I said calmly, it's the truth. Another long silence stretched between us. Then Julian's voice turned completely to stone. You know what I think? I think you just love playing the victim. That comment cut deeper than almost anything else he had said, because the painful reality finally clicked. Julian truly believed he was the reasonable one. I swallowed hard, keeping my composure. You think me setting a boundary is playing the victim? I think cutting your own son out of family dinners over a few words is completely manipulative. I stared down at the sawdust-covered floor, feeling a slow, dangerous anger rise up in my chest. It wasn't the kind of anger that explodes. It was quiet and deliberate, the kind that brews after years of silently swallowing hurt. For years, I said softly, I've walked on eggshells inside my own house, terrified of what you were going to criticize next. Julian didn't say a word. I hid my favorite furniture because of you. Still silence. I stopped making things your father loved because you made me feel like they weren't good enough. For a fleeting second, I heard something unfamiliar on the other end of the line. It wasn't anger, it was unease. But it vanished just as quickly as it came. You're exaggerating. No, I whispered. I'm finally being honest. That seemed to snap something in him. Fine, Julian barked. If you want honesty, here it is. You take everything as a personal attack because you refuse to adapt to the modern world. I frowned. What is that supposed to mean? It means the world changes, Mom. People change. You can't expect everyone to forever pretend that some blue-collar suburban lifestyle is the center of the universe. There it was again. That shame, that embarrassment, as if a heritage of handmade things and honest sweat was somehow a badge of failure. Suddenly, a comment Arthur made right after Julian left for Seattle flashed through my mind. He's running from something, he had told me. When I asked what he meant, Arthur just gave a sad shrug. He's running from himself. Maybe I didn't get it back then. I did now. Julian wasn't just rejecting my woodworking. He was rejecting every single memory that reminded him he hadn't grown up with money. And I, more than anyone, represented that past. You know what hurts the most? I asked quietly. Julian let out an impatient sigh. What? You act like having me as a mother is an embarrassment to you. That finally shut him up completely. For a few seconds, neither of us said a word. Then, his voice came back much lower. That's not fair, is it? No. Then why do you treat everything in this family like it's beneath you? I don't. You do. He went right back on the defensive. You have no idea how hard I worked to get the life I have now. I know you worked hard. No, you don't, he snapped. You have absolutely no clue what people in my circle are like. All of a sudden, for the very first time, I heard what was actually hiding beneath Julian's arrogance. Fear. Pure fear. Fear of not fitting in. Fear of being judged. Fear that someone would discover he came from a regular blue-collar family in Oregon instead of the polished elite fantasy he had built around himself. But instead of owning that fear, he turned it into superiority. I slowly sat down on the old stool by my workbench. You know what your father used to say? Julian didn't answer. He said people who are truly comfortable with themselves don't need to constantly prove they're better than everyone else. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, Julian let out a bitter chuckle. Wow. So now Dad would be disappointed in me, too. I instantly regretted saying it. Julian. No, it's fine. His voice sounded colder now, sharper. I get it. Marcus and Sarah are the good kids. I'm the bad one. That's not true. It sure feels like it lately. I rubbed my forehead, completely exhausted. This isn't about picking sides. Then invite me to next month's dinner. The demand came out fast and direct, like a test. I froze. A part of me wanted to just say yes, because that's what mothers do. We restore comfort. We diffuse tension. We open the door back up, even when we're still bleeding from the last time someone carelessly walked through it. But then I remembered the 4th of July. The humiliation, the anxiety, and the relief I felt at that first dinner without him. Most of all, I realized Julian still hadn't apologized. Not once. Not genuinely. Instead, he was explaining why his behavior should be tolerated. That wasn't remorse, that was entitlement. I took a deep breath. No. The word shocked both of us. What? No, I repeated gently. Not next Sunday. Julian went completely quiet. Finally, he whispered, Are you serious? Yes. Over a few comments about some wood? I closed my eyes. No, Julian. Over years of disrespect. For the first time since he was a little boy, I was letting my son sit with the consequences of his own behavior instead of rescuing him from them. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there afterward, staring at the quiet workshop around me. My heart ached. Of course it did. None of this was easy. But beneath the sadness, something else was growing. Self-respect. And once you finally remember that you deserve to be treated with kindness, it's very hard to go back to pretending that cruelty is an acceptable form of love. About 2 weeks after I stopped inviting Julian to our family dinners, Sarah called me on a Wednesday evening sounding incredibly nervous. Mom, she said carefully, Julian invited everyone over for dinner this Saturday. My hands froze as I was folding laundry. Everyone? Yeah, he said he wants to host a proper family dinner in Seattle. Something in Sarah's voice made me stop completely. What is it? Sarah hesitated. I think he's trying to prove something. Deep down, I already knew she was right. Nothing Julian did anymore was casual. Everything was a performance, a showcase, an image. Still, I agreed to go. Not because I particularly wanted to spend an evening pretending everything was fine, but because I still held on to hope, that dangerous spark a mother can never truly blow out. On Saturday evening, I made the drive to Seattle for the first time in nearly a year. Julian and Chloe lived in a luxury high-rise downtown, a place where even the air smelled expensive. The lobby was all minimalist cold marble and soft recessed lighting, and the doorman took an extra second to look at my plain coat before giving me a polite smile. Suddenly, I was intensely aware of every ordinary detail about myself. My comfortable but clunky flat shoes, the crease in my collar I couldn't quite smooth out. Julian had a way of making me feel like that lately, like I was a glitch in a system that needed an upgrade. Marcus and Sarah arrived at almost the exact same time. Marcus gave me a look, silently asking if I was okay. I managed a nod. When the elevator doors opened into Julian's penthouse, the first thing I noticed was how exquisite it was. The second thing was how freezing cold it felt. The apartment belonged in an architectural magazine. Massive glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, overlooking the Seattle skyline and the dark waters of Puget Sound. The giant kitchen island was spotless, clearly a place where no real cooking ever happened. Hidden speakers played a faint ambient electronic hum. Everything matched perfectly, and everything looked untouchable. A woman in a black uniform greeted us with a tray of appetizers, smiling politely. I blinked. Julian walked over wearing a massive grin. "Oh, great, you're here!" I stared at the woman. "You hired help?" Julian chuckled. "Hiring a private chef is just more efficient." Efficiency. I looked around the spotless kitchen. No smell of roasting food, no warmth, no mess, no memories, just a flawless presentation. Chloe appeared at Julian's side, holding a wine glass. "Eleanor," she said smoothly, "welcome to modern civilization." Marcus immediately muttered a curse word under his breath. Julian shot him a warning look. "Excuse me?" "Just a joke," Chloe replied, completely unfazed. Sarah already looked incredibly uncomfortable. We moved to the dining area, where a cold glass table was set with tiny portions of food that looked like art pieces. I didn't even know what half of it was. There was some kind of foam and patterns of sauce painted onto white porcelain. My youngest grandson whispered loudly to Marcus, "Where's the real food?" I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Julian heard him. "This is modern fine dining," he explained proudly. The boys looked devastated. Dinner started awkwardly. The hired chef would occasionally pop out to describe each course, using words like deconstructed and molecular fusion. At one point, when a single scallop was served on a plate, Marcus leaned over to me. "We are absolutely stopping for burgers on the way home." I almost choked, trying so hard not to laugh. For the first 20 minutes, Julian seemed to ride a wave of triumph, as if he had finally engineered the perfect dinner that put my gatherings to shame. Everything looked expensive. Everything sounded sophisticated. But everything felt emotionally vacant. Nobody relaxed. Nobody reached across the table to pass a dish. Nobody interrupted each other with big laughs. The kids barely touched their food. Even Sarah looked tense, trying her best not to say anything negative. At one point, Julian raised his wine glass proudly. "See, this is how life should look when you drop all that heavy, blue-collar sentimentality." Marcus stared at him. "What exactly is wrong with blue-collar sentimentality?" Julian let out a dramatic sigh. "There's nothing wrong with it. I'm just saying, people evolve." There it was again, that word, evolve. As if kindness, warmth, tradition, and working with your hands were just primitive flaws. Chloe pursed her lips a little. "Honestly, Eleanor, I think you're just way too attached to furniture in this house. It's like a pathological nostalgia." Sarah slammed her fork down instantly. "You've been humiliating Mom for years." "Oh, come on," Julian replied. "I was just offering some professional advice." "You were humiliating her," Sarah shot back. Julian leaned back in his chair. "I think everyone lately is suffering from some kind of persecution complex." The table went dead silent. I looked down at the tiny decorative smear of food on my plate, and all of a sudden a strange realization washed over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't intimidated by Julian's lifestyle anymore. I just felt incredibly sorry for him. Because despite the overwhelming smell of money in that room, this dinner was completely missing the only thing people actually remember. Love. Right then, Marcus noticed the massive log coffee table sitting in the middle of the living room. It was an incredibly exquisite piece made of walnut, completely preserving the natural live edge of the wood. "Wait a second," Marcus said, pointing at the table. "Isn't that the birthday gift Mom made and sent you 3 years ago?" Julian's face stiffened up just a fraction. "It's just a statement piece. You literally just told your guests it was a high-end custom import from Scandinavia." Marcus's voice turned freezing cold. "So you use Mom's craftsmanship to dress up your place, but you look down on where she comes from?" Julian's face completely changed. "Can we please not tie every single thing back to Mom?" Marcus shrugged. "You're the one acting guilty." "No, I invited everyone here so we could move forward." "By trying to prove your life is superior to ours?" Sarah asked, wrinkling her forehead. Julian scoffed. "My God, why does everyone always assume the absolute worst of me?" "Because you gave us a reason to," I thought to myself. But I didn't say a word. Then Chloe casually chimed in. "Honestly, I think people romanticize struggle way too much. There's really nothing noble about staying stuck in those small-town handmade habits forever." That was the absolute last straw. Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair. "You know what the problem with you two is?" "Julian," Chloe started. "No," Marcus cut her off firmly. "The two of you actually believe that money and so-called taste automatically make you better human beings. We never said that. But you imply it constantly. Julian looked completely exhausted now. Can we please not turn this dinner into a therapy session? Sarah crossed her arms. You're the one who invited us. Yeah, because Mom decided to exile me over a broken table and a few blunt truths. I finally spoke up, keeping my voice completely calm. This has never been about the table, Julian. The room fell quiet all over again. Julian looked straight at me. Then tell me, Mom, what is it about? I looked him dead in the eye and held his gaze for a long time. It's about how you constantly try to make everyone else feel small. Julian's expression shifted in that exact moment. It wasn't quite guilt. It was more like unease. Because deep down, he knew. He knew that the gatherings in our backyard were never just about eating meat and working with wood. They were about belonging. And inside this perfect penthouse, surrounded by expensive porcelain and a city skyline, nobody actually belonged to each other. The dinner ended a lot sooner than expected. Nobody lingered. At my house, people would stick around for hours after eating, talking, laughing, and packing up leftovers. But tonight, everyone looked like they couldn't get out the door fast enough. While we were waiting for the elevator, Sarah gave me a tight squeeze. Are you okay? I nodded gently. Actually, I'm doing really well. And strangely enough, I meant it. For the very first time, I saw Julian clearly, not as this powerful, dominant son whose approval I desperately needed, but as an incredibly insecure man who was running himself ragged trying to escape his own past. As Marcus and I waited for the doors to open, he glanced back at Julian's apartment door. Did you notice something, Mom? What's that? Nobody in that place actually looks happy. I thought about the spotless kitchen, the meticulously arranged plates, the forced sophistication, and the dead silence between the people inside. Then I thought about my crowded, noisy old workshop filled with laughter. All of a sudden, a major truth became crystal clear to me. Julian had spent years mocking my life because he confused freezing cold elegance with warmth. But you can't buy warmth. It has to be built slowly, patiently, by showing people day after day, year after year, that they are deeply loved. And deep down, I think Julian was finally realizing that his perfect life felt incredibly empty compared to an Oregon garage that smelled like sawdust. 3 days after that dinner party in Seattle, I was at a local lumberyard picking out some maple boards when I suddenly heard someone call my name from the end of the aisle. Eleanor Vance? I looked up in surprise. Maggie Lewis was standing there smiling at me, wearing the exact same bright red lipstick she used to wear back in 1998. I hadn't seen Maggie in almost 6 years. She definitely looked older, we both did, but her energy hadn't changed a single bit. She still looked like someone who was always rushing off to some incredibly exciting event. My God, I let out a soft laugh. Maggie! She immediately ran over and threw her arms around me. Where on earth did you vanish to from civilization? She questioned dramatically. I live about a 20-minute drive from here. It's practically the wilderness now, I laughed, feeling happier than I expected. Maggie just had that effect on people. Back when Arthur and I were young, Maggie ran an art gallery in the Pearl District, and I used to sell some of my handmade wood carvings through her on consignment. Those were some of the toughest years of my life financially, but somehow they were also the happiest. Before the kids grew up, before the grief took over, and before family dinners became painful, Maggie grabbed onto my shopping cart and immediately started chatting away. I heard about Arthur years ago, she said softly. I'm so incredibly sorry I wasn't around back then. Hearing his name still brought a little tightness to my chest. Thank you. How are your kids doing? I hesitated for a quick second. They're complicated. Maggie let out a knowing chuckle. Aren't they all? We ended up standing in that lumberyard aisle for nearly 40 minutes, talking about getting older, retirement, and how bizarre it feels to wake up one day and realize your kids have turned into middle-aged adults with values you don't even recognize. Then Maggie asked out of nowhere, Are you still doing your woodworking? I shrugged. Just bits and pieces around the house. That's not what I mean. I looked at her closely. Maggie crossed her arms. You are one of the most talented woodworkers I've ever met, Eleanor. I laughed right away. You're exaggerating. No, I'm really not. Her tone turned completely serious. People used to wait in long lines just to buy your carved rocking chairs. That actually caught me off guard, because honestly I hadn't thought about those days in years. Back then, Arthur and I were barely staying afloat. I was doing part-time consignment at the gallery, and he was working overtime at the school. Sometimes we'd pass each other in the hallway, too exhausted to even finish a sentence. But those years mattered. People actually loved my craftsmanship. Do you remember old Mr. Callahan, the retired mailman? Maggie asked, a smile breaking across her face. Yeah, I do. He saved up his money for 3 whole months just to buy that solid wood jewelry box you made with the hidden compartments for his wife. Standing there in that store packed with modern synthetic particle board, I suddenly felt younger, lighter. Then Maggie asked casually, "Why did you stop?" I frowned a little. Stop what? Making a career out of it? The question took me by surprise because the answer had always been so obvious to me that I never actually questioned it. For the kids, I said simply. Just life, I guess. Maggie tilted her head. You gave up a lot, Eleanor. I shook my head right away. No, I chose my family. Those two things are not the same. Her words stuck with me a lot longer than I expected. After I checked out, Maggie caught up with me out in the parking lot. Oh, I almost forgot, she said, quickly digging through her bag and handing me a brightly colored flyer. The Northwest Artisans Festival in Portland. I just stared at it blankly. Maggie grinned. I'm helping organize it this year. I want you to enter. I laughed instantly. Oh, absolutely not. Forget about it, Maggie. I haven't exhibited a piece of work in decades. Plus, I'm 64 years old. I shook my head firmly. I don't do competitions like this. It's not actually a competition, she countered. It's a community event. Still, no thank you. Maggie narrowed her eyes. Why are you acting so afraid? That actually annoyed me a little bit. I'm not afraid. Then enter. I opened my mouth to argue back, but then I stopped because an uncomfortable truth suddenly hit me. Maybe I was afraid, not of the woodworking itself, but of being judged, criticized, and failing out in public. Beneath all of that, Julian's voice was quietly echoing in the back of my mind. Outdated, low class, no commercial value, embarrassing. Maggie watched my expression change very carefully. Then her face softened. Oh, honey, she asked gently, who made you doubt yourself this much? That question hit me so hard I almost had to look away, because until that exact second, I hadn't realized how deeply Julian's comments had taken root inside of me. I used to create things with zero fear, with total confidence and pure joy. Now, even when I was completely alone in my workshop sanding a piece of wood, I was constantly second-guessing myself. Maggie gently squeezed my arm. Eleanor Vance, she said firmly, your craftsmanship used to bring warmth into so many people's homes. I gave an embarrassed laugh. That sounds a little dramatic? No, she replied, it's just the truth. That night, I sat alone in my workshop, staring at the festival flyer. The air around me was filled with that familiar, comforting scent of pine wood. For some reason, I kept thinking about the person I used to be before I became terrified of criticism. I remembered back when Arthur would sit out here, constantly cheering me on. One day you're going to have your own independent brand, he used to tell me. I always just laughed it off, but deep down, I loved my craft. Not just as a mother, but as myself. There's a massive difference between the two. Realizing that actually shocked me, because somewhere over the years, I had stopped being Eleanor. I had become the mother, the wife, the caregiver, the person who served everyone else. Maybe I forgot that beneath all that giving, I actually possessed a real talent. Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. Hey Mom, do you need me to come over this weekend to help tune up your chainsaw? I smiled softly. A few seconds later, another text popped up. By the way, that chair you made is the comfiest spot in my entire store. I laughed out loud. A split second later, Sarah's name popped up on the screen. Tell Mom if she doesn't carve a few more wooden birds this week, I am officially going on strike. For the first time in a very long time, being out in my workshop didn't fill me with a wave of anxiety. It felt alive again, warm, and actually wanted. Suddenly, looking down at that festival flyer, I could hear Arthur's voice echoing so clearly in my mind. You've still got it, Elle. Tears welled up in my eyes out of nowhere. After years of being mocked, looked down on, and told I was obsolete, a major truth finally clicked. Maybe Julian had spent so long criticizing my craft that I completely forgot other people used to think it was extraordinary. Maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to remember. On the morning of the Northwest Artisans Festival in Portland, I almost backed out. At 64 years old, fear doesn't feel the same way it does when you're young. It's quieter, more logical. It disguises itself as being practical. You start telling yourself things like, what's the point? You're too old. Nobody cares about handmade stuff anymore. I stood in my bedroom holding 2 different sweaters, trying desperately to convince myself I wasn't a nervous wreck. Sarah showed up first, ready to drive me downtown. The second she walked through the door, she gave me a knowing look. "You're panicking." "I am not." "You've already changed your outfit twice." I wrinkled my forehead. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because one of your shirts is still thrown over the couch." I glanced toward the living room and let out a heavy sigh. Sarah laughed softly, walking over to give my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Mom, you are going to absolutely crush it out there." Just hearing those words made me incredibly emotional, because encouragement had become such a foreign concept to me lately. I hadn't realized how starved I was for kindness until people started pouring it back into my life. Marcus met up with us downtown, trailing behind his kids who were already bouncing off the walls from drinking way too much hot cocoa. The festival took up nearly 3 full city blocks. Local artisans lined both sides of the closed-off streets, displaying everything from pottery and handmade leather goods to independent clothing labels and gorgeous artwork. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, strings of market lights were already glowing overhead. Music drifted through the crisp air as people bundled up in heavy coats strolled between the booths, laughing and chatting. Even though the weather was a bit overcast and chilly, the entire place felt vibrant and warm. Maggie spotted me from a mile away near the registration tent. "There she is!" Before I could even react, she lunged forward and grabbed both of my hands dramatically. "Eleanor Vance returns to civilization." I rolled my eyes. "You really need to come up with some new material, Maggie." "Nope," she replied proudly. "I know what works." She started babbling a mile a minute while pulling me along toward my booth. "You've already been making waves, you know." "What is that supposed to mean?" "People saw your name on the local exhibitor list." I let out a nervous laugh. "Maggie, nobody is going to remember me." She stopped dead in her tracks and looked me straight in the eye. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "you have absolutely no idea." My booth was right in the heart of the festival, nestled between a handmade soap vendor and a blacksmith. The sign above was simple: Eleanor Vance, traditional handcrafted woodworking. That was it. No trendy branding, no flashy slogans, just the woodwork. My creations. For the first 20 minutes, I just nervously adjusted the wood carvings on the display tables over and over, pretending not to notice the glances from people walking by. And then, my very first customer walked up. An older gentleman wearing a Portland Trailblazers cap stared at me for a few seconds, and his face suddenly lit up. "Wait a minute," he said slowly. "The Pearl Gallery, late 90s? I blinked in surprise. "You actually remember that?" He let out a big roaring laugh. "Lady, that solid wood humidor you carved with the hidden compartments ended up winning me the biggest business deal of my life because my top client fell absolutely in love with it." I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Within minutes, he walked away and came back with 3 more people. Then another small crowd gathered, then another. All of a sudden, people weren't just buying woodwork. They were sharing stories. My God, I used to check the gallery every single week to see if you had anything new. "You custom-built the vanity for my wedding gift back in 2001. My dad praised your mortise and tenon joinery for years." One woman almost started crying as she ran her hand across an oak bench. "This grain pattern reminds me so much of my grandfather's craftsmanship." That comment hit me deep in my soul, because I finally understood something Julian would never be able to grasp. Handmade things aren't just about wood and structure. They are memories, comfort, and connection. People weren't lining up because my designs were following some modern trend. They stood there because my work made them feel the actual weight of a soul. The second I realized that, something inside of me completely relaxed. I stopped second-guessing myself. I stopped overthinking, and I stopped hearing Julian's criticisms in my head. By mid-afternoon, my booth had one of the longest lines at the entire festival. Marcus looked completely stunned. "Mom," he whispered, leaning in close, "you're kind of a big deal here." I smiled. "Oh, relax." "No, seriously," Sarah chimed in. "People are literally taking photos of your chairs and posting them all over social media." My youngest grandson started proudly shouting to random strangers passing by, "That's my grandma!" Maggie walked past our booth, wearing a smile so huge you'd think she had just won an Olympic gold medal herself. "I told you so." I just shook my head with a laugh. "You are completely unbearable, Maggie, but you were right." And then, something totally unexpected happened. A young woman holding a microphone walked up to the booth. "Are you Eleanor Vance?" I looked up, suddenly feeling a bit nervous. Hi, I'm Jenna, a reporter with Pacific Northwest Living magazine. Do you have a few minutes for a quick interview? I almost dropped my polishing cloth right out of my hands. Me? She gave me a warm, gentle smile. We've been hearing people talk about your booth and your woodwork all afternoon long. Sarah immediately leaned over and whispered, Mom, do not even think about saying no to this. So, 20 minutes later, I found myself standing next to my furniture that smelled like raw timber, facing a video camera and professional lighting equipment, doing an interview with a reporter. Jenna gave me a warm smile. So, Eleanor, what is it that makes your work so incredibly special? I instinctively opened my mouth to say something modest and self-deprecating, but then I stopped myself. Because for years I had been downplaying who I was, shrinking myself down, and constantly apologizing for taking up space. This time I gave her the honest truth. I build these things because I want the people who use them to feel a sense of security. Jenna tilted her head slightly. What does that mean exactly? I looked around at the festival. I saw families laughing together, kids running through the crowd, and couples admiring handmade crafts. It means, I said softly, that truly good furniture should hold a family's memories, not make them feel like they aren't sophisticated enough. Standing right behind the camera, Sarah's eyes immediately welled up with tears. Marcus quickly looked away, pretending he hadn't noticed. Jenna smiled warmly. That is absolutely beautiful. Then she asked her final question. What originally inspired you to get into woodworking? I answered without even having to think about it. My husband, Arthur. It was always Arthur. I explained how we had restored our old house together, how working with our hands held our family tight during our hardest financial struggles, and how certain pieces of furniture carry memories that run deeper than any photograph ever could. By the time the interview wrapped up, a small crowd of strangers nearby actually started clapping softly. I felt incredibly embarrassed, but deeply moved all at once. Beneath it all, though, I felt pride. Genuine pride. Not because people were praising my work, but because for the first time in years, I stopped feeling ashamed of the very things that made me who I am. Around 6 in the evening, Sarah suddenly froze while looking at her phone. Her entire expression changed instantly. What's wrong? Marcus asked. Sarah looked at me carefully. Julian saw the feature. My stomach tightened up a little bit. What feature? Sarah turned her phone around to face me. Pacific Northwest Living had already posted a preview of the festival interview online. There was a photo of me standing behind my booth, smiling as I leaned against a gorgeous, handcrafted walnut dining table. The headline read, "The woman remaking community memories with love in her own 2 hands." My throat went completely dry because it had been a very long time since anyone used such kind, beautiful words to describe me. Marcus glanced back and forth between me and Sarah. What did Julian say? Sarah hesitated for a second, then answered in a low whisper. He left a comment saying, how funny that people are still romanticizing this completely uninspired, inefficient grunt labor. Marcus let out a bitter scoff immediately. You have got to be kidding me. But the strangest thing was, this time, I didn't feel crushed at all. I looked around at my crowded booth, watching total strangers happily touching my creations, laughing as they shared stories, and placing custom orders for furniture. All of a sudden, Julian's opinion felt smaller than it ever had before. It wasn't that it didn't matter, he was still my son, but he no longer held the power to define my worth. Maggie appeared at my side, holding 2 cups of hot coffee. Are you doing okay, Elle? I let out a soft, gentle smile. Yeah, and for the first time in years, I really mean it. That answer was completely true. I should have known Julian would strike back. Not to my face, we hadn't gotten to that point yet. But Julian was never the type to stay quiet when something made him feel like he was being replaced. It started the very next morning. My phone was ringing off the hook. Sarah called me first thing. Mom, have you looked at LinkedIn or Facebook yet? I was out in the workshop putting away some tools. No. Why, what's going on? There was a long pause on the line. Julian left a massive rant on the magazine's post. My chest tightened just a bit. Figures. A few seconds later, Marcus called me. He is completely losing his mind, he said bluntly. What do you mean by losing his mind, Marcus? He's getting into full-on arguments with people online. That made me stand up straight. What kind of arguments? Another pause. The kind where he's trying to use a bunch of architectural jargon and economics terms to prove your craftsmanship is backwards garbage, and literally everyone in the comments section is telling him to shut up. I closed my eyes. This wasn't the Julian I was used to. My son used to be confident, restrained, and perfectly packaged. But lately, every single reaction he had toward me didn't feel like confidence at all. It felt like panic. By noon, Maggie marched right up to my house without even warning me, holding her phone up like it was a piece of evidence from a crime scene. "You are officially viral," she announced. "I'm what?" She shoved the screen right in front of my face. The feature article had exploded overnight. It was flooded with comments, shares, and write-ups from local news outlets. People weren't just praising my woodworking anymore. They were sharing their own stories. This pure artisan spirit is exactly what's missing from modern manufacturing. My grandmother has a table just like this, and it is a priceless treasure. Look at that finish. Now that is what real luxury looks like. I stared at the screen in pure disbelief. "There's no way this is real." "It's absolutely real," Maggie said, "and somebody out there is incredibly pissed off about it." I already knew exactly who she was talking about. Julian. Later that afternoon, Marcus came over early. He was pacing a tight circle in my kitchen, looking like he was doing everything in his power not to just explode. "He posted again," he said. Sarah walked in right behind him, clutching her phone like a weapon. "He's telling everyone the festival is nothing but a smear campaign of working-class nostalgia." I wrinkled my forehead. "What does that even mean?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "It means he hates seeing people happy without his official stamp of approval. He feels like your spotlight is ruining his high-end personal brand." Sarah hesitated, looking down. "There's worse." I looked straight at her. "Tell me." Sarah's voice went entirely soft. "He brought up Dad." That stopped me dead in my tracks. "What did he say?" Her voice cracked slightly. "He wrote, 'People are romanticizing this blue-collar grunt labor out of pure sentimentality for the past. If my father were still alive today, he would never condone calling a lifestyle that literally worked him to death an expression of love.'" The kitchen went dead silent. Even Marcus stopped his pacing. Because this was the first time Julian had ever openly weaponized Arthur's memory. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a passing comment. It was a statement. Deliberate, cold, and calculated. I slowly sat down on a stool by the counter. My hands felt completely freezing cold. Sarah immediately sat next to me, grabbing my hand. "Mom, he's just trying to get a reaction out of you." But Marcus shook his head. "No," he said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "He's trying to rewrite history." Those words hung in the air longer than anything else. Rewrite history. Because that was exactly what Julian had been doing for years. Rewriting our past, rewriting who we were, rewriting what love looked like just so he could feel superior to it. That night I finally looked at the full post. Sarah was incredibly reluctant to show me, but I needed to see it. Underneath a screenshot of my magazine interview, Julian had typed out a massive statement. He called my work a romanticized aesthetic of poverty. He said people shouldn't confuse nostalgia with actual quality, and he implied that the public was being emotionally blackmailed by working-class sentimentality. And then came the line that cut the deepest. "My mother is a skilled laborer, but her generation confuses survival skills with cultural value. Her refusal to modernize kept our entire family trapped in a cycle of inefficient, hazardous manual labor." I read that sentence 3 times. Trapped in inefficient manual labor. As if the pieces of furniture I poured my heart into to build a childhood for him were some kind of disaster he had to escape, rather than the very foundation that allowed him to stand. Marcus leaned back against the counter. "He is seriously sick." Sarah nodded slowly. "No," she whispered. "He's just embarrassed." Embarrassed? There was that word again. For years I thought Julian was embarrassed by me. But sitting there, reading his words, I finally understood the deeper truth. Julian wasn't just embarrassed by me, he was embarrassed by where he came from, and I was the ultimate living reminder of everything he was desperately trying to outrun. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. My mind kept drifting back to him. Not the angry, arrogant version of him, and not the cynical man on social media, but the little boy who used to wear an oversized shirt as an apron, standing right here in the workshop helping me sand down rough timber. He used to call my craft magic. What changed? Somewhere along the line, success stopped making him proud and started making him ashamed of his past. And I had become the most visible monument to that past. The next morning Maggie called me again. Her voice was unusually grave. "Eleanor, I think you need to see something, now." I drove over to her place immediately. She handed me her tablet displaying a brand new post. This time, things had escalated into a full-blown war. Julian hadn't just typed a statement. He had uploaded a scanned photograph. It was a page from Arthur's private journal. The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. It was a deeply personal entry Arthur had scribbled out, his handwriting messy and frantic. Lumber is getting so expensive. Eleanor stayed up 3 nights straight working on that cherry cabinet. Our savings are totally wiped out, and this house is an absolute black hole for time and money. I honestly don't know how much longer we can stay afloat like this. Underneath the photo, Julian had captioned it. My father wrote this shortly before he passed away. I think the public needs to see the emotional manipulation behind this so-called family tradition. She held her own family hostage in poverty and exhaustion just to feed her hobby. My knees went totally weak. I had to grab the edge of the kitchen counter just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. No, I whispered. This can't be happening. Where did he even get that? Marcus, who had just rushed over from his store, saw the screen and slammed his fist onto the table. His storage unit in Seattle. During the last move, he took a box of Dad's old history books. The journal must have been mixed up in there. That notebook was never meant to be a weapon in a public argument. It was just a private vent from Arthur during one of his most anxious nights in the middle of the 90s recession. It was sacred. He has lost his absolute mind, Marcus roared. Sarah was quietly crying into her hands. He just wants to win, Marcus. He's willing to drag our family's past through the mud just to protect his narrative. Right then, a delivery truck pulled into my driveway. It was an overnight high-priority package delivered by FedEx. The return address was a top-tier corporate law firm in downtown Seattle. Marcus tore open the envelope for me. Inside was an official cease and desist letter. Reading the contents felt like a bucket of ice water pouring down my spine. Julian's architectural firm was claiming that the intellectual property for several of my core furniture designs exhibited at the festival, including the walnut table that had gone viral, actually belonged to his company. The letter stated that Julian had filed design patents on those exact pieces a few years ago for exclusive interior staging in his firm's high-end luxury real estate projects. He was demanding that I immediately stop commercially displaying or selling them as personal handcrafted items, or he would sue me for patent infringement and seek massive damages. That miserable piece of garbage! Marcus ripped the paper out of my hands, his eyes completely bloodshot with rage. He stole your designs. He took the furniture you gave him for free, patented it, lied to his clients saying it was his original work, and now he's suing his own mother for copyright? Sarah covered her mouth, completely horrified. How could he do this to us? I sat frozen in my chair, my legs completely numb. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a sudden, sharp clarity about exactly what Julian was doing. If he could prove that my craftsmanship was worthless, or that it legally belonged to him as a high-end designer, he could completely erase his blue-collar background. He could bury the truth that he stole his mother's life's work just to sustain his elite illusion. By noon, the whole town was buzzing. Rumors started popping up on local design forums, and people who didn't know the whole story began questioning if I was just riding the coattails of my big-shot architect son from Seattle. Maggie was shaking with pure fury. He's trying to completely wipe you out of history. He's doing this to his own flesh and blood. Marcus looked at me, completely drained. Mom, what are we going to do? I didn't answer right away. I looked down at the cold, clinical legal letter on the table. Then I stood up and walked over to the oldest, deepest wooden chest in the corner of my workshop. Arthur had left this to me before he died. It held over 30 years of our shared life. I opened the lid. Inside lay the rest of Arthur's journals, but beneath them were all of my original woodworking sketches dating all the way back to the early 1980s. Every single page had a date stamp, notes on revisions, and feedback written in Arthur's distinctive red pen, offering suggestions and words of encouragement. Some of the pages were still stained with coffee rings and spots of dried varnish from decades ago. I reached in and pulled out a sketchbook from 1998, turning to the exact schematics for the walnut table. Right there on the margin of the blueprint was a tiny crayon doodle that a 6-year-old Julian had scribbled. A calm, intense focus settled over my mind. It wasn't an emotional reaction, and it wasn't panic. It was just pure determination. I turned around to face Marcus and Sarah. Marcus, call Mr. Abernathy downtown. Tell him I need an emergency legal consultation. Sarah, go grab your video camera and set up the tripod. By the following afternoon, I didn't get into a petty online shouting match with Julian. I didn't type up a massive paragraph explaining myself on Facebook. I just had Sarah hit record. In the video, I stood in my workshop surrounded by the smell of fresh timber, wearing my worn-out canvas apron. The camera focused clearly as I used a traditional hand plane to smooth out a slab of walnut wood. Shavings curled up and spilled onto the floor, making that rhythmic, soothing rasping sound. Some people say that manual labor is a symbol of being backwards, I said calmly, looking straight into the camera lens. Some people say it's just a romanticization of poverty. I set the hand plane down and picked up Arthur's complete journal from the table. My son recently made a public post sharing a snippet of my late husband's diary. It was written during one of his most anxious nights. But what Julian didn't tell you, or what he didn't have the courage to show you, was the very next page. I opened the old notebook, letting the camera zoom in tight on Arthur's authentic flowing handwriting. I read the words softly. I complained about the cost of lumber yesterday. But this morning, when I saw Eleanor finally finish that cherry cabinet, I felt entirely ashamed of myself. With hands covered in calluses, she is sustaining this family in the most honorable way possible. This house might be worn out, but every single inch of wood she finishes by hand gives us our dignity. That is the actual weight of love. I closed the journal and took a deep, steady breath. As for the matter of intellectual property, I brought out the 1998 sketchbook, turning to the design Julian had filed a patent on, holding the page close to the lens so the viewers could see the 6-year-old Julian's crayon drawing and the faded date stamp from decades ago. My attorney, Mr. Abernathy, had already verified that Julian's patent application involved a clearly falsified timestamp, and that he had used the physical furniture I gave him as a gift to file for the design rights. My son tried to intimidate me with legal letters, claiming my designs belonged to his elite firm in Seattle, I said, looking right into the camera. My voice didn't shake a single bit. It was filled with absolute quiet strength. But he forgot that the marks of a handcraftsman cannot be forged. This sketchbook was filled out when he was 6 years old. He tried to steal a lifetime of my work, purely to hide the truth of where he came from. I don't hate him for it, I said finally, my eyes completely at peace. Dan, I cannot let him continue to rewrite the truth. Wood doesn't lie, and neither does time. The video was uploaded with zero promotion, but within 2 hours it spread like absolute wildfire. This time, the internet wasn't just feeling nostalgic. People were furious, and all of that rage was directed straight at Julian. His wealthy investors and high-end clients in Seattle saw the video. In the Pacific Northwest tech and luxury real estate bubble, where terms like authenticity, original design, and artisan heritage are practically a religion, intellectual property theft and public relations fraud are an absolute death sentence. Several major clients immediately announced they were pulling their business from Julian's firm. The state architectural board announced a formal ethics investigation into his practices. His own business partners scrambled to release statements scrubbing his name from their website to save themselves. As for Chloe, she packed her bags and moved into a boutique hotel the day after the story broke. The flawless, pristine, elite armor that Julian had spent years constructing in Seattle dissolved in a matter of days, buckling like cheap plywood under the sheer weight of the truth. For 2 whole weeks after Sarah posted that video, I didn't hear a single word from Julian. No phone calls, no texts, no managed PR statements, just a dead, suffocating silence. And inside that silence, I didn't feel any grand sense of victory or joy. I just felt a heavy, lingering exhaustion, like a soldier sitting on a quiet battlefield after a massive, draining war. Then, on a Tuesday during the 3rd week, a letter appeared in my mailbox. Not an email, not a cold piece of legal correspondence. It was a handwritten letter, the penmanship uneven and hesitant across the envelope. I sat down at the oak kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I tore it open. Inside was a single page, and it was brutally, completely honest. Mom, I don't even know how to say this without sounding like I'm still making excuses for myself, so I'm just going to write it out. I was wrong. Not just about one specific thing, but about everything. I think I spent so long trying to run away from our past that I completely forgot it was the only place I ever actually learned how to love. In my social circles in Seattle, everyone has a flawless pedigree and a trust fund. I was so terrified that they would look at me and just see the son of a regular blue-collar Oregon carpenter. I thought that by running you down, by packaging your designs as high-end products for my firm, I could finally wash the smell of sawdust off my skin. but I see now how much I hurt you just to make myself feel important." Chloe left. My firm is restructuring without me. I lost every single thing I used to use to prove I was better than everyone else. I realize now that I only hurt you to cover up how scared I was. I don't know how to fix this. I don't expect things to just go back to the way they were because they shouldn't. I just don't want to run away from you anymore. Julian. I read that letter 3 times. My chest felt tight, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from pain. It felt like a release valve on a lifetime of pressure. Marcus and Sarah read the letter later that evening. Marcus stared at the paper for a long time before letting out a slow breath. He finally hit rock bottom. That's the most honest thing he said in his entire life. Sarah looked up at me, her eyes welling with tears. "So, Mom, what are you going to do?" I looked at the handwriting, then around at this old house Arthur left behind, thinking about the lives we were all trying to rebuild in our own separate ways. "I don't know," I told them honestly. And for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a failure. It felt like space. Space to finally take a real breath. A month after the storm hit, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Julian pulled up to the house in Portland. He didn't knock. I was out in the workshop sanding a new piece of timber when I saw him through the window, just standing by himself out in the driveway in the pouring rain. For a long moment I didn't move. Neither did he. He looked different. Not physically, but his entire energy had shifted. The polish was gone, the armor was down. He just looked like a man who had been inside his own head for too long and forgot how to put on a performance. I set my sandpaper down, wiped the dust off my hands with a towel, and walked outside. When I opened the door, Julian didn't speak right away. "Hey, Mom," he finally said, his voice sounding so much smaller than I remembered. "Hey," I replied. A long silence stretched between us. It wasn't hostile, it was just unfamiliar. He looked down at his wet shoes hitting the pavement. "I wasn't sure if I should come." I gave a slight nod. I get it. My lack of anger, the fact that I wasn't pushing him away but wasn't pulling him in either, seemed to leave him completely unsure of what to do next. Marcus, who happened to be over helping me clear some branches off the roof, walked out from the side of the house holding his tools. Sarah pulled up to the curb at that exact moment, just getting off her shift. The 4 of us stood out there in the rain in a strange, quiet standoff, like a family trying to remember its original shape. "I watched the video you posted, Mom," Julian said softly, rain dripping down his face. "And I read the rest of Dad's journals. I'm so incredibly sorry I twisted his words like that." Marcus crossed his arms but didn't interrupt. Sarah stayed completely still. Julian kept going, his voice cracking just a bit. "I used to think success meant putting as much distance as possible between myself and anything that made me feel humble, but I confused humble with worthless. I didn't realize I was trying to make myself look big by stepping all over you guys." That honesty ran deeper than anything he had ever said before, because he wasn't trying to defend himself. I stepped to the side, holding the door open. "Do you want to come inside?" Julian hesitated for a second, then nodded. Inside the house, he walked through the rooms incredibly slowly, as if he was seeing them for the very first time. The same Victorian window frames, the same handmade furniture, the exact same spaces he used to mock without a single thought. Finally, he sat down at the oak dining table in the kitchen. He didn't take the head of the table, and he didn't sit down with that old, supreme confidence. He just found a seat. "I don't know how to fix this family," he admitted. Marcus let out a heavy breath. "Well, that's at least a decent place to start." Sarah didn't say anything. I sat down right across from him. "Julian," I said gently. He looked up at me. "I don't need you to be perfect, and I don't need you to be some elite architect, but I do need you to stop hurting me." His face tightened instantly, absorbing the actual weight of that statement. "I don't think I even realized how far I was taking it," he whispered. "I think you did," Marcus said calmly. "You just didn't care." Julian didn't argue. He looked down at his hands resting on the wood. "I spent so much time trying to prove I was different from this family that I ended up completely forgetting who I actually was." Sarah's voice finally softened just a bit. "You're always going to be family, Julian, whether you've got sawdust on you or not." Julian took a deep, shaky breath. "I know that now." The room went quiet, but this time the silence didn't feel hollow. It was filled with a fragile, honest possibility. "I don't expect everything to just go back to normal right away," Julian said, looking at me. I nodded. "Good, because I don't think I even know what normal means anymore." Marcus leaned back against the counter. "Then let's start with something incredibly simple." Julian looked over at him. "Like what?" Marcus shrugged. Like next month's Sunday dinner. You just show up and you don't try to prove a damn thing to anyone. Julian blinked, taking it in. Then he gave a slow nod. I can try to do that. Sarah suddenly stood up from her chair. Well, you might as well stay for dinner tonight then. Julian looked up in surprise. Really? Sarah gave a tiny smile. I happen to have brought extra smoked sausage, and it's pouring rain outside anyway. I looked at the table, at the space between us, seeing a place that used to feel like a war zone slowly turning into something else. I'll go grab your father's favorite wooden pepper grinder, I said quietly. Julian's eyes instantly softened. For a split second, I didn't see the man who had been trying to rule Seattle. I just saw the little boy who used to stand in my workshop getting sawdust all over his face. I remember that grinder, he whispered. Marcus let out a fake groan. Please don't start getting all sappy now, we haven't even eaten yet. That broke the tension perfectly. Julian let out a faint laugh, and then Sarah started giggling. All of a sudden, for the first time in years, we were all sitting in the exact same room without trying to tear each other down. Dinner that night was quiet. It wasn't awkward and it wasn't tense, it was just cautious. Julian didn't criticize a single detail. He didn't put on a show. He just listened. After we finished eating, Julian stood at the sink helping me wash the dishes. I don't really know how to do this part, he said softly under the sound of the water. Which part? I asked. Just being here without feeling like I have to prove I'm better than everyone else. I turned the faucet off and looked at him. You don't have to prove anything to us, Julian. He nodded slowly, looking into my eyes. I'm sorry, Mom. It wasn't a defensive apology and it wasn't rehearsed. It was entirely real. I watched him for a long moment, seeing the sincerity in his face, and then I gave a gentle nod. I know. He let out a long, heavy sigh, like he had been holding his breath for years. I don't expect you to just forgive me right now. I shook my head slightly. Forgiveness doesn't really work that way anyway. He gave a faint, weak smile. So what happens next? I looked past him into the kitchen. Marcus and Sarah were sitting at the oak table Arthur built, laughing softly about something. This life, which had been so badly cracked but never fully destroyed, was still standing right here. We just take it piece by piece, I said. Julian nodded. Okay. After everyone drove home that night, I stood alone in the kitchen once again. But this time, the space didn't feel empty. It felt repaired in the places that mattered. It wasn't seamless, and it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't crumbling anymore either. I gently ran my fingers along the edge of the oak table, Arthur's table, and whispered into the quiet room. We're still holding on. Outside, the Portland rain kept tapping against the glass. But inside my chest, something had finally settled into place. It wasn't an ending, but it was a beginning that I wasn't afraid of anymore. Sitting out in my workshop later that night, I finally understood something I had refused to see for a very long time. Love inside a family isn't always loud, and it isn't always gentle. Sometimes it doesn't even look like the respect we deserve. But it stays love until it gets pushed aside by arrogance, ego, and that toxic need to feel superior to where you came from. For years I thought that just taking the blows was a sign of strength. I thought that as long as I kept that oak table polished and kept the monthly barbecue tradition alive, my family would stay whole. But I learned an incredibly painful lesson. A family cannot survive on tradition alone. It cannot survive on habit. And it absolutely cannot survive when one person is constantly sacrificing their own dignity just to keep a fake surface peace. Julian didn't turn cruel overnight. It happened slowly, through tiny comments, small humiliations, and all those moments where I chose silence instead of drawing a line in the sand. I told myself I was just being a patient mother, but the truth was, I was letting myself slowly disappear inside my own home. And Julian, in his own way, had gotten completely lost, too. He confused success with tearing away his own past. He actually believed that rejecting his roots would somehow make him stronger, but in reality, it only left him more isolated and incredibly fragile. Forgiveness didn't just happen all at once in a single moment. It didn't instantly wipe away years of hurt. It simply became a possibility when honesty finally took the place of pride. I also learned something deeply important about myself throughout this journey. I am not just a mother who sacrifices everything for her family. I am a woman with my own passions, my own identity, and a profound pride in the things I create. And I was that woman long before I ever started measuring my own worth by someone else's approval. Healing doesn't mean forcing things back to exactly how they used to be. It means accepting who we have become and choosing to rebuild right there on top of the ruins. It isn't perfect, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it is entirely, beautifully honest. If this story touched your heart, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced distance, misunderstandings, or silent pain within your own family? Please leave a comment and share your story. I read through every single one of them. Don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next emotional family story. Before you go, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is over there right now. Just remember, through all of these difficult emotional struggles, you are never alone.